Good evening, everyone. I think we're coming through the mic there. Welcome once again to Weaver's Mennonite Church, and for those joining us online or via recording, welcome to all of you gathering for this third of 5 lectures on Mennonite history, remembering the 500-year anniversary of the beginning of the Anabaptist movement. Before we begin, once again, my name is Caleb Schrockhurst. I will be giving next week's lecture, Lord willing. This evening, we're excited to hear from Elwood Yoder, who I will introduce in a minute. First off, I want to thank, once again, the main sponsor for our lecture series, the Shenandoah Valley Mennonite historians, and particularly Chair Jim Hirschberger. I also want to thank Weavers, and in particular, Nevin Lehman, running the sound booth and live stream for us. I will highlight this again at the end, but next week we'll be back here at Weavers, and the week following that we'll be at Eastern Mennonite Seminary featuring Andrew Suderman. But for this evening, we are hearing from Elwood Yoder, and I have so many things to thank Elwood for. In particular, he taught myself and many, many young Mennonite and Christian folks the importance of studying history, and in particular, our own historical journey. So I had world history and Mennonite history and American history with Elwood over the years. So you'll hear some strains of his thinking in my thinking next week. Another thing to highlight is that later this year, I believe, Elwood and Steve Nolt will publish a book on Mennonites, the history of Mennonites in Virginia, not just Virginia Conference, but all Mennonites in Virginia over the years. So we look forward to that publication. And tonight we'll hear from him on this title of Farmers in Search of Land, Renewal, and Religious Freedom, Mennonites, Amish, and Anabaptists in the 1700s. So I will pray, and then Elwood, I invite you forward. So let's pray. Dear God, we thank you for the chance to gather tonight, to learn once again from the great cloud of witnesses who have gone before, inspiring us towards faithfulness in pursuit of you and your shalom for the world. Be with Elwood as he shares tonight. May his words convict us to move ever closer to you and your vision for us and for how we can witness to you in the power of Jesus in this world. Be with Elwood as he shares, bless him, and be with us to receive his word. In Jesus' name, amen. Elwood.
Thank you, Caleb. I, too, want to thank Nevin Lehman, tech specialist, Sandy Good, administrator, and Pastor Kurt Stutzman for allowing us to use this space for these lectures. You know, Caleb Schrockhurst is a man of big ideas. That's why we've maintained a friendship over the years. Big idea. He and his wife Stephanie are going to East Asia as missionaries in May. That's a big idea. And then last summer, Caleb invited me out for coffee. He said, I've got an idea. I said, oh, what is it? You know, we've had 5 centuries. How about 5 lectures? I paused a moment, and one of the first questions I asked Caleb was, do you really think anybody will come out on a February evening for a history lecture? We have our answer, Caleb. At that point, neither of us had any idea whether anyone would show up, but we forged ahead nevertheless. And so I began reading in the 1700s last fall. And everything I picked up, everything I read, including, I'd recommend Troy Osborne, Radicals and Reformers, highly recommend a 2024 new book on Mennonite history, very readable. Everything I read was about farming and farmers. And I remember the moment where I decided if I do anything other than that, it wouldn't represent the Mennonites very well of the 1700s, a very different era than what we heard last week from Dr. Springer. So during the 1700s, Mennonite farmers searched for land to own, to cultivate, and to pass on to their children. They sought renewal of faith for themselves and their communities. They hoped for toleration for their distinctive and radical beliefs, and many picked up and migrated elsewhere. Mennonites seem to love the land. On the third day of creation, God created dry land called earth, bringing forth all kinds of plants, crops, and trees. Mennonites liked Psalm 24, verse 1. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. In this lecture, we will review the migration of Mennonites from the Netherlands east to Poland, Prussia, and Russia in search of land and religious toleration, if you can see the green arrows behind me. Second, we will analyze why Mennonites fled Switzerland to the French Alsace and German Palatinate, the red arrow. Third, we will trace the westward migration of European Amish and Mennonite families who sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to a new world in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Ontario. First, Dutch migration to Poland, Prussia, and then very briefly, Russia. But that's your topic next week, Caleb. A new homeland for Dutch Mennonites emerged when hundreds migrated east to Poland and Prussia. As early as the 1540s, persecution pushed Mennonites out of the Netherlands. Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire unleashed furious persecution against Flemish Mennonites in Flanders in the 1530s and 1540s, same era we heard about last week. The Mennonites had to move. Many of those put to death, as accounted for in Martyr's Mirror, came from these difficult years of persecution in the Netherlands. The violent disaster at Münster had tarred the reputation of Mennonites in the Netherlands. And while some Dutch Mennonites grew wealthy, not all did so. Difficulties in making a living, wars, and rapid urbanization pushed many Dutch Mennonites to move east. At the same time, nobles and ruling officials in the Polish province of West Prussia welcomed religious minorities. Rural Dutch Mennonite farm families felt pulled to the Vistula Delta of Polish Prussia. In Poland, they found religious tolerance offered by noblemen who wanted good farmers to raise grain and milk cows and recover marginal land in the river delta. The nobility needed more farmers, so Mennonites from the Netherlands and North Germany moved east to seek better opportunities for themselves and their children. The Vistula River in Poland seemed to call out for the Mennonites to move. In the 1540s, among the earliest to migrate east, a dozen Flemish Mennonite families from Flanders, if you can notice the province of Flanders on the map. They fled persecution. Remember Charles V, unleashing furious persecution. They moved to Chihowka. Notice the spelling on the map, P-R-Z-E-C-H-O-W-K-O. That's the indigenous, that's the local name pronounced something like Chihowka. They moved there along the Vistula River, about 65 miles south of Danzig, modern-day Gdansk, along the Baltic Sea. By the mid-1600s, the old Flemish Mennonites had established a thriving church in Poland, and other farm families from the Netherlands soon joined them. A trickle of migration turned into a steady stream of Mennonites who fled the Netherlands and northern Germany, such that by 1780, there were approximately 13,000 Mennonites in West Prussia. Compare that with the 4,700 in Virginia Mennonite Conference today. Some 13,000 Mennonites in West Prussia, both pulled and pushed towards Poland. In the Netherlands, however, during the 1700s, the population of Mennonites decreased by 83%. A rapid decline in the Netherlands. One Dutch Mennonite church per year in the 1700s closed. 100 churches closed in the 18th century. Members of the Chihovka Mennonite Church built beautiful farms, planted orchards, dug roads and water canals, and operated Holland-style windmills that beautify the countryside. They supplemented their income with linen weaving. From the old Flemish church, the men wore long, drab, collarless coats with hooks in eyes instead of buttons. I want you to understand how they dressed. It'll matter a bit later in the lecture. Marriage with outsiders for the old Flemish was not tolerated, not even with the more progressive Frisian Dutch Mennonites. By the mid-18th century, mid-1700s, they began to lose their Dutch language, living in Poland, and they started speaking West Prussian Plattdeutsch, a Low German dialect infused with Dutch words. I won't get into the 20th century or the 19th century lectures, but that Plattdeutsch is spoken far and wide in the Western Hemisphere today. Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Paraguay, Bolivia, and more. Even some, I believe, in the United States. A legacy of the language that was spoken in Prussia and then in Russia. The agricultural skills of Dutch Mennonite immigrants enabled them to prosper. In the Vistula Delta, Mennonites developed new solutions for crop farming and cattle breeding. They produced a unique yellow cheese that stayed fresh for a long time and could be shipped through the Baltic Sea to places like Amsterdam, London, and Lisbon. In the Vistula Delta, most of their villages and fields were below sea level. So they became experts at drying fields, managing drainage systems, and building raised dikes to keep the river water from flooding their farms. Mennonites in Polish West Prussia leased blocks of land from the Polish noble barons, sometimes as many as 2,500 acres in a section. Polish Mennonite farmers installed a windmill at the lowest place on their farm to pump the water away from their fields. One source said that might take 3 to 4 generations of workers to accomplish a successful windmill pumping the water away. By the late 1700s, Mennonites in Prussia made up the largest group of Mennonites in the late 18th century. There was no other place that had more Mennonites than Prussia. They had numerous settlements, as you can see perhaps from my map, in the Vistula River region. All of those little dots represent settlements of Prussian Mennonites. Now, a few of the Mennonites lived in the bigger cities and worked in the trades, especially in the 1600s, though the guilds were tightly controlled with the crafts and the industries in the cities, and the guilds didn't want the Mennonites making their ways into the guilds, so they were kept out. And Mennonites turned to farming. Some of the names in the Chihovka Mennonite Church, notice the yellow dot, if you can see it on the map. Some of the names from the Jehovah Mennonite Church in Prussia included Clausen, Thiessen, Jansen, Dirksen, Voth, Unruh, Schmidt, Sawatsky, and Ratzlaff. The Jehovah Mennonite Church kept a record book from the very, very early days. It was passed along, different people keeping records, went over to Russia. It's out now in like Gossel, Kansas, where that record book is kept. A lot of records over the years. Now, by the end of the 1700s, Poland vanished from the map. You see the contemporary overlay of map there. But Poland vanished in the late 1700s, swallowed up in war by Austria, Prussia, and Russia. They just dissolved it, took different parts of it. And I didn't try very hard in high school to teach that lesson, Caleb, honestly. That's when people yawned and they wondered what was on their phones. That's kind of one of those things that Poland just vanished. It would be after World War I until Poland reappeared on the map. So when the Prussian kings in the late 1700s took away their religious freedoms, especially the military exemption for Mennonite men, tens of thousands of Vistula Delta Mennonites picked up again and migrated to South Russia and Ukraine along the Dnieper River. That's next week's story. Approximately 40 to 50 families in Jehovah Mennonite Church migrated to Russia. They went in 2 or 3 groups. The group that traveled to Russia in 1821 met Tsar Alexander I. Tsar Alexander got out of his carriage and asked to meet them. The Tsar inquired, "Where are the Mennonites headed? Where are you folks headed?" "To Malachna in Ukraine," they responded, to which the Tsar said, "I wish you well on your journey. Salute your brethren. I have been there." Did I miss one? Yeah, you can't hardly see that, but that's an old house from one of the history books of a Russian historian, Russian Mennonite historian from the U.S. That was a house that was left in Poland when they migrated to Russia. And so Jehovah Mennonite Church became Alexanderwall Mennonite Church in Russia, meaning Alexander and well. They had met the Tsar. He wished them well, so they renamed their church Alexanderwall. Okay. Some 60 years later, approximately, because they were losing their religious freedoms in Russia again, the Alexanderwall Mennonite Church migrated to Harvey County, Kansas. Now, I'm into the 19th century, but I'm going to follow the story just a little bit. I have some grandsons watching from Heston, Kansas this evening. I'm showing you this photo. Remember the day, boys, where we went out to Gossel? It was so windy. What I thought about was, what did those Mennonites from Russia think when they first encountered the fierce winds of the Kansas plains? We couldn't hardly open or close the truck doors. It was so windy. I mean, it was nothing. I haven't experienced winds like that in Virginia at all. I wanted to see the Alexanderwall Mennonite Church. Elder Jacob Buller led the entire Alexanderwall Church, plus other families, about 800 of them, as they embarked on 2 steamships across the Atlantic, sailing to New York City, and then taking the train to Kansas. They built a large meeting house in Gossel, just a few miles north of Heston. By 1920, there were almost 1,000 members in the church. Today, with approximately 500 members, the Alexanderwall Mennonite Church is a congregation of Mennonite Church USA. Just to show you the cycle of events. Let's turn now to the Swiss and South German Mennonites. our second topic. I want to explain to you a significant boat trip down the Aar River and the Rhine River down to Amsterdam. In 1711, 5 boats sailed rapidly downstream from Bern, Switzerland, in the Alps Mountains to Amsterdam, near sea level, where the boat trip ended. The distance was about 550 miles. Swiss authorities were forcibly removing Mennonites from Bern because of their radical beliefs. Late 1600s, early 1700s, the Mennonites were getting kicked out. Many of these are our forebears in Switzerland. They had to leave. They were Anabaptist. Get out. Had 5 boats in 1711. Let's load them up and send them down the river to the Netherlands. The Mennonites believed church and state should remain separate. They called for believers in Jesus to be baptized upon their own decision rather than as an infant. And their commitment to follow Jesus in life meant that they would not take up weapons to defend themselves or their government. The 1711 boats began in Bern. If you can see that on the left, I've highlighted Bern in yellow. They begin on the Aar River, taking that somewhat north to the Rhine River. Then they head due north, all the while going downstream. So the Swiss Mennonites and the Amish packed up what they could in a trunk or two. Officials worked to send all of the Anabaptists out of Switzerland with threats of imprisonment or being sent to the Mediterranean Sea to row on ships as enslaved people if they ever returned to Switzerland. Get out. Religious intolerance. The boat trip lasted 22 days, from July 13 to August 3, 1711. 4 of the 5 boats were loaded up with Amish, and 1 boat had Mennonites. The Mennonites were not interested in going. The Amish had agreed, some of the leaders had agreed, and so they showed up when the time came to leave. Different principles there. Very different scene. The Mennonites were trying to get away from these boats. The Amish loaded up and said, okay, we've agreed to do this, let's go. 52 of the passengers were Anabaptist prisoners, I presume mostly Mennonites, taken from the prison in Bern and plopped on the boats, and away they go. Now, about 20 years earlier, a division had occurred among the Swiss and South German Mennonites. An Anabaptist minister named Jacob Amann was concerned about the increased acculturation and assimilation of the Mennonites to the ways of the culture surrounding them. You can sort of read that, at least up front here, I suppose. Jacob Amann wanted to renew the Anabaptist principle of separation from the world. And he wanted to return to a stricter style of congregational discipline. Most Mennonites disagreed with his views, so a division occurred, or beginning in 1693. It took a couple of decades to really solidify, with Mennonites following Minister Hans Riest and a minority of the Mennonites following Jacob Amann. Notice how that's turned on its head in North America in 2025. Some 400,000 in the Amish communities across the U.S. and Canada, if you count all the children and everybody. Now compare that with any other group you want to compare it to, 400,000 today. Started out as a minority group within the Mennonite, among the Mennonites. The Amish men, and here I think back about the conservative Dutch men, the Amish men aboard the boats had long, untrimmed beards, whereas the Mennonite men had trimmed, shorter beards. The Amish men wore broad-brimmed felt hats. Dress and hair appearance were not a major difference in the early days between the Mennonites and the Amish. However, Ammon's followers wore plain clothing, and over time, the simple way that the Amish dressed became the primary way that folks identified them as compared to the Mennonites. The Amish emphasized Christian principles of simplicity, modesty, humility, and self-denial. On the 22-day boat trip down the Rhine, most of the Mennonites, when the boat stopped at 2 or 3 places along the Rhine for supplies and so forth, most of the Mennonites got off and never came back. The Amish leaders had given their word that they would go to Amsterdam all the way, and so the Amish stayed on. If you can see the city of Mannheim on the map, that's where a number of the Mennonites just got off and said, we're not coming back. 346 Anabaptists arrived in Amsterdam. Most of them were Amish. The Swiss exiles lived in large warehouses for 2 weeks alongside a canal in a busy commercial city, one of the most prosperous cities in northern Europe, where the plain Swiss farm families recently kicked out of their rural mountain farm homes in the canton of Bern, Switzerland. Amsterdam seemed strange, cosmopolitan, and worldly. During the 1500s and 1600s, the Mennonites from Switzerland experienced persecution in cities, so most moved out to rural areas in isolated mountain valleys. Some Swiss farmers had to be careful, or they might fall out of their fields. In these rugged mountainsides of refuge, they could live in isolated towns, yet still be a witness to their faith in Jesus. Nevertheless, they worshiped together in secret, in caves or hidden rooms in barns. Lord willing, some of us will be able to visit this cave near Zurich. Some of you have been there, I know. I've never visited this cave where the Anabaptists went in secret to worship and be together. Evangelism among these Swiss Mennonites was from neighbor to neighbor. And as more and more joined the Anabaptists, it further provoked the authorities who defended the state-controlled Reformed Church. Now, by the early 1700s, it had been 5 or 6 generations since the first Anabaptist radicals broke from the Catholic and Reformed churches in Zurich and Bern. Younger generations needed to be taught. Found this portrait on Wikimedia Commons, an Anabaptist minister teaching a family in a rural region of Switzerland. Younger generations had to be taught about water baptism when they were old enough to choose it for themselves. In the image, the artist has the kids not listening to the older minister very much. They're making eyes at each other and are in competition for what they can get away with there in that image. It's a striking image. Now, among the 346 Anabaptist refugees, by the way, there's a 3-volume series from which we get a lot of these details. Some of you are aware that over the last 25 to 30 years, there's been a group of historians, Amish, Plain, and Mennonites, working together to produce a 3-volume series. This is volume 3. A 3-volume series and it's filled with primary sources. And what they've done, I didn't help on it at all. Did anybody help on this project? Anybody? What they've done is taken Dutch and German and Swiss documents, translated them into English so people like me can read them and have access to these sources. Many of these details are coming out of this wonderful 3-volume set, Documents of Brotherly Love. Around 100 of these 346 refugees joined the old Flemish Groningen Mennonites. I talked about them prior. Now, the Swiss Amish farmers from Bern joined skilled farmers from the Netherlands, and they formed a new community. Their union reinforced the link between agriculture and simplicity. They lived as a close-knit community with farming as their preferred way of life. The Flemish and Swiss farmers found success, now get this, by shifting from dairy farming to potato production. It seems the Swiss migrants who came down the Rhine River might have packed a potato or two in something to bring along. Here's the Columbian exchange, this big principle of products being exchanged in the 16 and 1700s. And the Swiss migrants apparently brought the potato along. They began planting it in the Netherlands, in Groningen. Nearby, the city of Groningen was the village of Witmarsum, the birthplace of Menno Simons, whose parents, one source I've documented here, said his parents were probably dairy farmers. Later in the 1700s, some of those Swiss Amish families in the Groningen area picked up when they had some money, and they migrated to Pennsylvania to join kin and church folks who had already migrated to Pennsylvania. Now, the Palatinate and the Alsace were central farming regions for the Swiss and South German Mennonites and Amish. In the French Alsace, King Louis XIV issued royal orders in 1712 to expel about 100 Amish and Mennonite families. These Anabaptist families had improved the land in the Alsace, but King Louis XIV was on a mission to purge France of anybody who wasn't Catholic. There was a much wider story there, but clear over on the one side of France, these Anabaptist families had to get out, even though they had made the land much better than when they arrived. Mennonite families fled Switzerland and the Alsace, and they moved further north to the Palatinate. Increasingly, because of their farming skills, authorities tolerated these Mennonites. Economics, religion, they get mixed up sometimes, and the nobles in the Palatinate were beginning to tolerate these Mennonites because they could produce, and they were hard workers, despite the fact that Mennonites were Anabaptists and in a minority religious status. They farmed, the Mennonites did, on rented land with leases at varying amounts of years. However, in the early 1700s, their protection fees doubled, and they were restricted in their rights to purchase land. One German elector, Charles III, limited the number of Mennonite families in the Palatinate to 200 families maximum. Mennonites in the Palatinate met in homes until they built a few church buildings for worship by the late 1700s. And so their desire to migrate elsewhere steadily increased. Mennonite farmers in the Palatinate and Alsace led the agricultural revolution of the 18th century in mainland Europe. The three-field system used for centuries called for a field to be planted with one set of crops one year, a different set in the second year, and then it was to be left fallow or with no crops in the third year. But David Mullinger, an outstanding farmer, mid-1700s, worked to increase yields from his crops, and he discovered how to replace the traditional three-field system with an intensive use of the land made possible by fertilizers. Now, I'm going to use the word nitrogen in the next paragraph. I don't think these Mennonites knew what nitrogen was. but they were beginning to discover that they had to get something back in the soil with legumes. Mollinger purchased a neighboring wooded hill that was bare, and on an experiment, from what I read, he planted the bare top of the hill in clover and scattered limestone over it, which he had ground from his mill, and it raised an excellent crop. So instead of letting the land fallow each alternate or third year, as was the practice in Germany, Mollinger discovered that he could improve the soil by planting clover for pasture and hay, which put nitrogen back in the soil. Farmers began to understand that legumes like clover, alfalfa, and beans took nitrogen from the air and worked it into the soil that corn or wheat could use in the next farming cycle. I've had to talk to a couple of my brothers-in-law who are farmers to get some of these details about how this works, because I'm not a farmer. That's not my life career. Now, when Mollinger and the other farmers began to use manure from their cattle as fertilizer, farmers were just getting rid of the manure, just doing something else with it. The Mennonites began to use it on their fields, and the fertility increased. David Mollinger was a key farmer thinker in the mid-1700s agricultural revolution, which increased European population as the food supply increased and stimulated the emergence of a large middle class. And one Amish historian wrote, he said, this was really the beginning of the end of feudalism. As the middle class expanded and grew and had money, the power of the nobles to control things became less and less. However, the push to leave Germany in the early and mid-1700s increased for Swiss and South German Mennonites and Amish. After years of leasing land in the Palatinate, old feudal agreements meant that the original Catholic or Protestant owners could take the land away from the Anabaptists at any time. You've been leasing for 50 or 60, 70 years, all of a sudden somebody comes in and goes back to the old contract, takes your land. You see why there's a push to go somewhere else. A few Swiss families, Swiss Mennonite and Amish families, moved east to Volhynia in Ukraine, on this map in yellow. This is a very different place than Khortytsa or Malachna, where the Mennonites will migrate to set up a lot of colonies in the early 1800s. They go to Volhynia. They farm there among Dutch Mennonites and Hutterites until most of the Swiss Anabaptist families in Volhynia left again to migrate to Kansas and South Dakota. If you saw the wonderful issue that Paul Schrag put out in July of 2024, Anabaptist World magazine, at the very end he said, and I'm a descendant of Mennonites who lived in Volhynia. It's Paul Schrag, editor of the Anabaptist World magazine. And at Zion Mennonite Church, where Joy and I attend, there's a lady coming. One day we were talking after church, and I talked about different things to people, I suppose, and some others who attend Zion. And she said, yeah, my ancestors lived in Volhynia for a while before they migrated to Kansas, and she ended up in Virginia. Dutch Mennonites were the first Anabaptists to migrate west across the Atlantic Ocean. A few settled in New Amsterdam and lived there when the British took Manhattan Island and renamed it New York. Okay? At about the same time, Peter Placoy established a small settlement of Mennonites in the colony of Delaware. But that didn't last very long. Mennonites arrived in North Carolina in 1710 and in the 1750s, attempting new colonies. Their settlements didn't last very long. Strong pushback from the indigenous peoples, lack of abilities in the groups. Information about those colonies is simply lost. The knowledge of what happened and the information about those colonies is gone. Now, the Swiss and the South German Mennonites felt pulled to the colony of Pennsylvania. Parents wanted to help their children and grandchildren get started in farming to be able to purchase more land. The Quaker government in Pennsylvania kept a low profile, essentially absent from the new settlers' lives. William Penn had dedicated his colony Pennsylvania to be a haven for all kinds of religious minorities. Now, notice this, among the 30,000 Germans of all denominations who migrated across the Atlantic Ocean in the 1700s, about 4,000 were Mennonite, and about 500 were Amish. Now think about that again. Only 500 are Amish. And today, in all the communities in North America, some 400,000. Okay? Some numbers to think about. Now, I'm going to tell a little bit about my own story because in the last number of months I've been doing some research. And I discovered Unser Light, a history book by Leroy Beachy from Ohio. A wonderful book in which he tracks the Yoder story right back through. The Yoders, spelled in Europe with a J, J-O-D-E-R, had lived near Bern, Switzerland for over 300 years. It can be tracked back into the 1200s, the Yoder name, in that region of Bern, Switzerland. But they had to flee Switzerland. Remember, Anabaptism was a radical thing. Jost and Anna Yoder had their babies properly baptized in the Reformed Church. But then all 10 of their children, they had 12 children, 10 of them lived to adulthood, all 10 as adults joined the Anabaptists and were rebaptized. They had been invited to join, again, by their neighbors. Now, Jost Yoder was a distinguished local man in Steffensburg, in Canton of Bern. He was some kind of an official in the local government. But at the age of 85, Jost Yoder, because all 10 of his children joined these Anabaptists, he was put in prison for 6 months, 85 years of age. His children had left the Reformed Church and joined the Anabaptists. One of Jost and Anna's sons, Hans, married Katharina Risser, as I did 10 generations later, married a Risser. That was a nice discovery. Hans Yoder, with a J, married Katharina Risser. He was in the Swiss Risser today. Hans and Katharina joined the Mennonites. One of Hans and Katharina Yoder's sons, Jost Yoder Jr., joined the Amish in that division. Jost Yoder Jr. ends up following Jacob Ammann, stricter separation, et cetera, et cetera. But in the year 1711, the same year as those boats going down the Rhine River, 18 years after the initial Amish Mennonite division, Jost Yoder Jr. from the Palatinate, age 36 I think he was among a group of Amish men who tried one last time to ask for forgiveness and reconciliation with the Mennonites. I read that document. It's been translated in English, the account of that meeting. It lists all of the men who were among the Amish. It doesn't list the Mennonite men that they met. It's all the Amish men. And they go and they try one more time, but too many bad things have been said. There's too much confusion between them. And the Mennonites say, nope, it's too late to resolve the split. Now, 3 children of Jost Yoder Jr., who is Amish, and his wife Magdalena were aboard the Francis and Elizabeth, it's a British ship, for probably a month and a half, landing in Philadelphia on September 21 of 1742. Again, these records are pretty detailed. Amish historians have done a really good job digging these details out. Deep in the Mennonite Historical Library at EMU, found this book that has Christian Yoder's signature. That signature has been verified in another book that Christian Yoder had. So we know that's his signature, but it's barely legible. You can't really read it. That's his signature. Christian Yoder, among his siblings, there were 3 of them, arrived in Pennsylvania with a family of 8 children aged 2 to 17, 6 weeks aboard the ship to get to Pennsylvania. He was probably an ordained minister because he carried a small devotional book to the New World with prayers, hymns, and readings for weddings, communion, and baptisms. I'm a descendant of this Christian and Anna Yoder. Now, there's a younger brother of Christian Yoder, Hans, who died during the Atlantic crossing. Remember, there were 3 siblings with their families. Hans passed away and was probably buried at sea, leaving his wife, Barbara, a widow in the New World. Christian and Anna Yoder, with their children, moved to Berks County, Pennsylvania, and farmed. Oh, and when they arrived, Joder became Yoder, anglicized, Yoder. Another story. I want to give credit to my colleague Stephen Nolt for alerting me about this story that comes out of Volume 3, 2023 copyright. New information. Steve says, take a look. I want to tell you the story about Barbara Burkholder. Get a little bit more local here. At Weavers, formerly Burkholder's Church. Did you know that this church was once called Burkholder's before it was called Weavers? Barbara Burkholder, a Swiss Mennonite widow with 6 children, joined 5 Mennonite families who decided to migrate to Pennsylvania in 1754. There's 4 pages of translated documents in this book with these details. These 5 families were part of a Mennonite congregation in the Swiss Jura Mountains, north of Bern. Now, among these 5 families, there were 3 women who were all widows. Among them, they had 17 children altogether. Barbara Burkholder had 6, one woman had 8, another younger woman had 3. The records state that the 5 families were poor. I can say that because that's exactly what the record said when they made this arrangement in 1754. These families were poor. So their Mennonite church in Switzerland gave each family money to travel to Pennsylvania. It gives the amount, but I can't make any there's no way I can figure out what that means in dollars today. But there's a specific amount that each family was given. And the travel loan is what it was to be paid forward by these families to the Deacons Fund in their future Mennonite churches in Pennsylvania. There's an entire document that still is available to look at if you can read the local language. Now it's in English. So the Mennonite elders of that church said, here's money to get to Pennsylvania. When you get there, pay the loans forward. The footnotes on the one page said that there's evidence that at least 2 of the families and their children paid that loan forward into the Deacons Fund in Pennsylvania. Now, Barbara had a son, Peter. He was 11 years of age when they sailed. It took the families 5.5 months of travel over land and sea to get to Pennsylvania. Remember, all these 5 families, 3 of the heads of family are widows. They've decided, we got to go. Let's try our fortune in Pennsylvania. Now, this 11-year-old boy became Peter Burkholder Sr. You may have heard that name of local history. When the Revolutionary War came along, Peter Burkholder Sr. refused to muster or march with the Pennsylvania militia during the Revolutionary War. And he migrated with his family then to the Shenandoah Valley in the 1790s. Now, Peter's wife, Margaret Huber Burkholder, 48 years of age, passed away in 1798. Anybody know where she's buried? Not at Weavers. Weavers wasn't around yet. What's the prior church? Trissels. Margaret Huber Burkholder is buried in the Trissel Cemetery in 1798. The Trissel Cemetery has people buried there from 4 different centuries. She was buried there in 1798. Virginia Mennonites ordained Peter Burkholder Sr.'s son, Peter Burkholder Jr., as a minister and then as a bishop. And Peter Burkholder Jr. was the leading minister in Virginia Conference, and he preached in a log meeting house that folks first called Burkholders And then later, it became known as weavers. Now, that first log meeting house was across Raleigh Pike. It was situated on the hill across the road here. This is the third meeting house for weavers. The first one is where Peter Burkholder Jr. preached and did his work. He became well known among Mennonites. Now, one of Peter Burkholder Jr.'s sons, Martin Burkholder. Okay? You know where I'm going with this. Built 100 years after Barbara Burkholder decided to take her family to Pennsylvania, 1754, 1854, Martin Burkholder, just across the ridge here, at the Brethren and Mennonite Heritage Center, sits a red brick house. Martin Burkholder, the great-grandson of Barbara Burkholder, who immigrated, built that house with his wife, Rebecca. Renewal and disruption. I'll try to move a little faster here. Martyr's Mirror is a stunning book. It has many, many sketches in it. It has circulated widely among Mennonites wherever they've gone. Oh, and even at times it's given as a wedding gift. You're going to get one of these, Phil and Lucy, next week when you get married. It's one of your gifts. It was this Dutch, originally in Dutch language, with these sketches that became widely circulated. People could open it up. And there's a story of Dirk Willems. Most of us know the story. It's the sketches of Jan Lyken, his copper plate etchings, 4.5 by 5.5 inches, that made this book into a living book. Probably very few of us have read very much in the book, but we've leafed through and looked at the images. And my wife and I decided we would sort of keep it out of sight when our grandkids come, because the images are not very pretty to look at. We know the story of Dirk Willems from the copper plate etchings that are now on the cover of the current Martyr's Mirror. In the 1700s, Martyr's Mirror may have been the most important link between Mennonites and the Netherlands, where it was first published in Dutch. Prussia, the Palatinate, Pennsylvania, Ontario, Virginia, helping to build a broad Anabaptist identity. There's no doubt that the Dutch work on this volume helped to create the identity of Mennonites far and wide, going back to the martyrs and the early church. This image of Katharina Mullerin in the Martyr's Mirror reveals that a third of the Anabaptist martyrs were women. Katharina was kicked out of her town near Zurich, and eventually everybody in her village who was Anabaptist had to leave and get out. Martyr's Mirror is a big book centered on a minority faith that lives today globally. Of course, it's online. The text and the images are out there if you want to go look. Let's talk about the Prussia Bible. In the 1530s, Christopher Prussia worked in Zurich, Switzerland, and he produced a Bible in the vernacular Swiss-German language, which was more readable to the Swiss people, especially the Mennonites and the Amish. It was different than Martin Luther's High German Bible. I want to take you to this Bible, Abraham Strickler. If you read Harry Brunk's Volume 1, he says one of the very first Mennonites to migrate into Virginia was Abraham Strickler. Purchased land in 1727. Abraham farmed, there we go, and he also traded for furs from the Indians to take back to Pennsylvania and sell to make money. The Strickler family had this Bible in their family for 450 years. 1536 to today. Today it's at the Shenandoah Heritage Village Museum in Luray. That's in a case. I couldn't touch it. I bumped my head on the glass when I tried to look at it closely.
But you'll see that the edges are black from years of use. The cover clasps are broken off, and the page is frayed. But the 1536 sketches and German print inside seem vibrant. A few comments on the Revolutionary War. This war challenged the non-resistant peace beliefs of the Mennonites in colonial America. Mennonites and the Amish had said they would be loyal to the kings. They moved into Pennsylvania. All of a sudden, there's a lot of hotheads running around in Pennsylvania and elsewhere fomenting a revolution. All of a sudden, what are they going to do? Who are they loyal to? Are they loyal to the King of England? Many said yes. But then the revolutionaries in the colony said, no, we're going to break from the King of England. Mennonites in Pennsylvania were second and third generation descendants of those who had immigrated earlier in the 1700s. The Revolutionary War was about Enlightenment values of independence, citizenship, and self-rule. Formerly, Mennonites had been subjects of a king, a monarch, or a queen. They had few or almost no rights. Suddenly, at the end of the war, 1781, they are citizens of a new country. Some aren't sure what to do. Keep honoring the King of England or the U.S. Congress. A few families, about 100 Mennonites after the Revolutionary War, migrated, here's one of our key words, to Ontario, Canada. There, they could continue to live under the King of England for a while. When Mennonites moved to Rockingham County, pre-contact indigenous groups had lived here for eons. Numbers vary, depending on what source you look at, for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Along the Linville Creek, I point in the right way, along the Linville Creek, there's a burial ground for indigenous peoples. About 800 Native Americans are buried there. The Smithsonian did a study there in the 1800s, but we haven't been able to look at that site because it's on private land. There was an article about that dig that was done in 1892. Preacher John Rhodes' family in Luray was massacred in the French and Indian War, 1764. After the Revolutionary War ended, Mennonites began moving to the Linville Creek region of Rockingham County. Some of those who migrated in the 1780s and 1790s might sound familiar. Brenneman, Brunk, Brickholder, Funk, Guile, Heatwall, Rhodes, and Showalter. When the Mennonites cleared land to farm along Linville Creek, the Iroquois and other indigenous groups had mostly moved away, using the region occasionally to hunt and obtain fur and hides to trade. But when the Mennonites arrived in Rockingham County, they discovered that there were enslaved Africans who were also here. The enslaved Africans had been here for 169 years prior to the arrival of the Mennonites. During the 1700s, 3/4 of all of those who had landed in British North America were enslaved, indentured servants, or convict labor. Let me finish with a few stories and a little bit of analysis. There was a hardworking farmer in the Palatinate, mid-1700s, who had become wealthy, and he was accused by those who were jealous of producing counterfeit money. So one day the Mennonites elector, the official, confronted the Mennonite farmer. And the man held out his blistered hands. And he said, all his money came from the soil through the work of his hands and under the blessing of God. I'm going to skip my analysis and just get to the point. Somehow, keep your hands in the soil. 1700s was an era. It is about farming, but we today, whether we farm or not, can do something in the soil to keep our hands and get some dirt under our nails occasionally. A second story. Most of you know the story of Jacob Hostetler, whose family in 1757 discovered they were in the middle of the French and Indian War. These German-speaking people in Pennsylvania were considered British, even though they didn't know English very well. They were German. But the French and the Indians, arrayed against the British, saw these German settlers as the enemy. So one night, the dog barked at Jacob Hostetler's house. The family had been paring and drying apples for the winter ahead. Joseph, age 11, hopped up when he heard the dog bark. His brother Christian, age 13, the two young fellows reached for their guns. Later, Christian and Joseph, who were both captured by the Indians, said, if our dad would have let us, we could have shot and scared the Indians away. We were pretty good marksmen. Jacob Hostetler said, sons, put your guns down. We don't shoot at people. There was an instant of decision. And 45-year-old, I think it was, Jacob Hostetler, he said, we believe in peace. The two fellows later said, we were good marksmen. We could have saved ourselves. 3 in the family were killed, 3 were captured, and the log home was burned. It's one of the more famous stories, well-known stories of peace in the Amish Mennonite tradition of Pennsylvania. My analysis is act in ways of peace, teach peace, and promote the peace of Christ in this dark world. I'll skip a story, get to the fourth story. Maria Bogley, 25 and single, accepted the Bern authorities' offer to sell her possessions and travel on one of those boats down the Rhine River to Amsterdam. Maria handed over $324, or dollars I think it is, to the government trip manager to be returned to her when she arrived in Amsterdam. Maria was among 103 Swiss and Amish and Mennonite refugees who joined the old Flemish Mennonite community in Groningen. Remember? They switched from dairy farming to potatoes. Maria had been baptized as an infant in the canton of Bern, but she chose baptism, again by choice, leading to her removal from the country. Maria, again 25 and single, began to farm the rich peat soil in the Netherlands. The details in the source book says she got $340 back from her $324. I don't know where in the world that money came from. Was it interest? Did the Dutch Mennonites pay her more? Don't know. That detail is left out. Soon after she settled in Groningen, Maria was able to purchase a house and a plot of land for herself. This story shows us that by the mid-1700s to late 1700s, there was a transnational identity that was forming. Books like The Martyr's Mirror, the Deutscher Confession of Faith, the Ausbund, which was used in many places. These were identity-creating features. And whether Mennonites lived in Prussia or over in Ukraine or in Philadelphia or Lancaster or Berks County, there was a common identity emerging of Anabaptism being the formative background of these different Mennonite groups. My analysis is that there was a growing set of diversities and transnational Mennonite connections, identity connections, that increased during the 1700s for a variety of reasons and will increase again in the 19th century, but that's next week's lecture. Thank you very much.
Of questions. Time for a couple questions. Thank you, Elwood. So if you have a question for Elwood to answer, please raise your hand, and we'll get to it. Make me come all the way to the back, right at the beginning.
Was the Froschauer Bible the one translated by Zwingli, the Zuricher Bible? Was that a different one?
It's also called the Zwingli Bible, yes. That's on the plaque in the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. It says the Zwingli Bible, or known as the Froschauer Bible. It's a good point. It was officially the Zwingli Bible, printed by Christopher Prussia and popularized by the Anabaptists who liked that version of the Bible. Good question.
There were a couple of guys helping Zwingli translate that Bible who themselves later became Anabaptists.
How about that? Thanks, Jim. There's a question up here, Caleb, about the, yeah, this is called Documents of Brotherly Love. They're available in the email libraries. That's where this is from. It's just filled with primary sources. And you go here when you know there's something in here and you want to see more. And sometimes the details don't mean much, but occasionally they really do. In the back, there's a question.
Did you get any sense at all in your study that the Mennonites who were moving in were aware that they were pushing out peoples who had lived there for hundreds of years?
I skipped 2 paragraphs in my lecture on that very topic. The Mennonites moved into Berks County, Lancaster County, Franconia area, and then into Virginia, and didn't seem to be much aware of the indigenous peoples who had been pushed on. To the credit of the Mennonites and Amish, they didn't see many of the indigenous peoples because prior political powers had moved them on. Now, in Pennsylvania, there was certainly contact between the groups. This is not a good part of the story necessarily. I said that with the indigenous peoples, Mennonites followed established patterns of settlement that included the loss of land for the indigenous peoples. Mennonite farmers raised European crops, and they domesticated animals. That included weeds and germs, which remade the natural world and undercut the indigenous ways of life, even in places where direct European Indian contact was minimal. The farmers were changing the very way of the natural order of things. And even without being aware of it, they were fundamentally changing the environment as it came. Good question. There's a fairly recent book by Royden on this, the way these farmers encountered, or didn't encounter, but yet changed the very environment in which they lived.
For years, I've been told that the Bronx in New York City is named after a Dutch Mennonite family. And the is in that because people would say, let's go up visit the Bronx family. Do you know anything about that? The Bronx Anabaptist family from the Netherlands?
I've read about that a long time ago. Yes, there were Mennonites in New Amsterdam, and then they were there when the British took it over and named it New York. I have read about that. I don't know the connection between those Bronx and the Bronx of Virginia. That connection, I don't know. Yeah. Look, there's another one or maybe 2 more.
Okay. Yeah, 2 more questions. Oh, okay. Andrew first.
Thank you. Later on in your lecture, you talked about you had this one nice little snippet where you said renewal and disruption. You demonstrated and talked about some of the disruption that took place within Europe, the Anabaptists within Europe, and the way in which they were seen and perceived as radical within that context. As they immigrated and migrated to North America, or could you say a little bit about the ways in which they were disruptive in the North American context, or were they?
The farming thing would be one. Pennsylvania became a German-speaking colony, a British German-speaking colony. Part of what I wanted to say was that the renewal was a way of changing from within the Amish saw one way of renewing, of separating from. Mennonites saw more of acclimating to, finding ways to acclimate with the people. Here in Virginia, the Mennonites very quickly joined the English-speaking environment here in Rockingham County. By the Civil War, most Mennonites spoke English here. That's a good question about disruption. Typically, the Mennonites were farming the land and working those ways. There's very little said, for instance, prior to the Civil War about slavery, the enslaved. We have one or two primary sources which show that. But the Mennonites were here, and there were maybe 10% of the people in Rockingham County were enslaved. But there's just very little said. Joseph Funk has one comment, and Peter Burkholder Jr. has another comment against slavery. Not a very good answer, but that's a good question. Thank you. Back here.
Well, I think you've in part responded to the question. How, in your reading and research, how did Mennonites interact with the whole issue of slavery? I was just curious what your findings were.
Of slavery?
Yes.
Well, to begin, as far as we know, no Mennonites who were active in the Mennonite church here in Virginia, which was the only state that had the enslaved, ever owned slaves. Now, it seems clear that there was some trade of labor over time, because in the minutes of the Virginia Conference, former moderator, they talked about what to do if an enslaved person worked on your farm and you're trading labor. So they were very much in discussion about that. But both Peter Burkholder Jr. and Joseph Funk spoke against slavery, but we wish there'd be more commentary against the enslaved, but it's just not there.
Last question here.
Okay.
In my research of my family and the Shanks, Michael Shank, who came from Pennsylvania in the Shenandoah Valley, and then descendants, because of the slavery issue, left Virginia, went into Pennsylvania, they married with Blossers, they went out and settled in Fairfield and Allen County, Ohio. And Abraham Brenneman was one of those progenitors who was said to have walked overland to Ohio to visit the relatives, So that's what I know about from my research.
S-H-A-N-K or E-N-K?
Oh, well, my grandmother was S-H-E-N-K, and Daniel Shank, her father. But when I did the research, it went back to the S-H-A-N-K. So it may have been S-C-H-E-N-K at some point. Who knows? Yeah. One of the relatives who was the artist decided to be S-C-H-E-N-K. So take your pick.
Okay. Join me in thanking Elwood again. Thanks once again for coming, and I'll see you all back here next Thursday.